this recognition that Satyajit Ray offered made him the very first modern Indian filmmaker, and which is what I think we all recognized with his very first film when it came. Because nobody had ever seen a film like that. There have been films about subjects of that nature, etc., etc. Of course, we also know that, for instance, the one of the most remarkable things about Satyajit Ray was both his humanity, his humanism and his compassion. Because in his films, you really did not actually have villains. You did not actually have villains in his films. You always had people, human beings, of different dimensions, different kinds, different psychologies, different positions that they took also because of the circumstances in which they were placed. So you had this whole business, and stories were never driven by plots even. They were driven essentially by characterization, and this is a characterization. And through the characters, the interaction through the characters, the narrative started to develop. Now, this was in many ways, as far as Indian cinema is concerned, totally revolutionary. This hadn't happened before. And from him onwards, of course, it continued to happen. Now, this is, to me, a very significant process. But it's also a significant process in terms of, you see, the reason I quoted this, Herbert Simon, was simply because when the agricultural society developed, you developed a whole culture. And that whole culture, which we today call traditional culture for ourselves, our traditional culture, was the creation and development over the entire length of the period of the agrarian society. And that is something that we need to recognize, because it was there for thousands of years. After the agrarian society, the turning point for agrarian society into industrial society, that took a few hundred years, 200, 300 years. Didn't take too long. And this is the period in which cinema emerges. And cinema emerges in this period, and this is when we say something, modernity begins from there. And the fact is that Ray represented that more than anybody else as far as Indian cinema is concerned. And of course, we who came after him learned a great deal from this whole process. And I think now we don't think about it, but we moved away from what we saw, what was the tradition that we had, into an area of modernity. That does not necessarily mean that we reject everything that is there in tradition. You never do. Nobody ever does, because it's part of your internalization. Every human being internalizes what went before. After that, now, you see, even cinema itself, because this is the point that I think is very important to make, even cinema itself is something like industrial society too, is a society like the agrarian society, which is in human and terms of labor and everything else, is a top-down society. It's a vertically organized society. Industrial society too, despite everything else, continues to be this. But with the recognition, there is a concept of equality. There is something that you say, this is, we consider equality as the ideal. We consider the fact that human rights is essential if we want to be properly just to all our people, or meaning human beings worldwide. But it hasn't happened in the industrial society. It is starting the recognition that society probably needs to be worked horizontally, laterally, for it to actually be equal, means that you should be able to. You see, one of the problems with cinema is that you make a film, you show it to people who you have no contact with.